Hi, I'm Butch Delaney, and welcome to the series, I'll Bet You Didn't Know. In these lessons, we're planning to recall some of the Bible stories that are well known and focus on a few that are not so well known. We're looking for the obscure, the amazing, and the downright strange stories that the Bible contains. This lesson is all about a prophet of Israel at the time of Jeroboam. His book in the Bible chronicles his life. He was an interesting man. I'll bet you don't know what Amos's name means. Well, I'll give you some clues right here. You probably guessed it. Amos means burden bearer. It's a very appropriate name for the man who God placed a big burden on his back, as you will see. But remember, he is the burden bearer. Now, Amos was a prophet in Palestine, but I'm willing to bet you don't know which one of these cities was his home. Did he come from one of the cities in Israel in green or in Judah in purple? I'll give you a clue. Amos was known as the shepherd of one of these cities, and maybe that'll help you answer the question. He lived in Tekoa, and Tekoa was a small city just a few miles south of Jerusalem and a bit below Bethlehem. It was just inside the city circle of the municipal cities around Jerusalem, not quite in the sticks, but just barely. I'll bet you didn't know to which province Amos was sent. In other words, was he a prophet to Judah, his own country in purple, or to Israel, the other country in green? You only have two choices here, so your odds are pretty high on this question. Surprisingly, even though he lived in Judah, he was a prophet to Israel during the reign of King Jeroboam II in about 760 BC. Jeroboam reigned for about 40 years. He was a mighty king. The kings in Judah during this time were Amaziah and Uzziah. Well, here's the real question. What was Amos's profession? Amos tells King Amaziah that he was neither a prophet or the son of a prophet. So what was his profession? I'll bet you don't know. Amos tells King Amaziah that he was neither a prophet or son of a prophet, but in 7:14 he describes his profession. The Hebrew is boles shikmim. It's plural for shikma, or what we might consider today sycamore. The Greek is griorgos. Now, I'm willing to bet that you know the sycamore tree. It is often the tallest of the trees in any stand of trees, and you probably know it for the hard brown balls that it produces. Its seeds are well protected in prickly armor. We also know figs. My Aunt Effie, my grandmother's sister, had a huge fig bush in her yard. I never liked figs. I preferred my figs in the Newton form, if you know what I mean. So, yes, we know fig trees. But I'm willing to bet you've never heard or never seen a sycamore fig tree. Well, you probably remember the wee little man Zacchaeus who climbed up in one to see the master. But I'd be surprised if you didn't know the true nature of the sycamore tree and what one really looks like. So here is a very old sycamore tree. It's in a park in Jerusalem, and it's a not quite so sturdy Middle Eastern tree. As an evergreen, it produces new green leaves that emerge before the old leaves wither and die and fall away. But it produces small fruit that turn bright red when they're ripe. Now, what you may not know about these trees is that it produces flowers like all pollinating trees do. But here's the weird thing. Its flowers are completely inside its fruit. Insects of all kinds cannot get to the flowers of the trees. But over time, a tiny fruit wasp has built its life around the life cycle of this tree. Without this tree-specific wasp, its flowers would never be pollinated, and the tree would eventually probably be removed from the face of the earth. Jesus noted that most fig trees that were barren are worthless. And this would be the kind of tree the tiny Zacchaeus would have climbed to see the Lord. Can't you just see him standing on one of those lower branches looking at Jesus as he came down the street? I'll bet you don't know for certain what kind of people ate the figs. Were they a delicacy? Were they normal food, fodder for animals? Or were they on the list of unclean foods that the Israelites could not eat? Well, they were certainly not the food of kings and queens. It was food that was generally despised by the middle and the upper classes, and it was food for the poor. And you'll understand why in just a few minutes. I will take a large bet that you didn't know what kind of work a sycamore fig dresser did. Now, Amos is sometimes referred to as the shepherd of Tekoa. Does this mean he shepherded sycamore fig trees? He fed them and led them to watering holes? He moved them to greener pastures when necessary? No. You might be surprised to know, though, that he was a pest control specialist. He was the Terminex, or the Orkin guy of the day. The pests that he controlled were very, very tiny little specialized wasps that only hung around sycamore trees in the Middle East. And they are the reason why we don't have sycamore trees here in America. Amos's job was to keep these pests from burrowing inside unripe figs to pollinate them. The life cycle of this tiny wasp, it's small enough to fly through the eye of a needle, almost a minuscule insect. The life cycle of this wasp was inextricably linked to the life cycle of the huge sycamore fig tree. One could not live without the other. Their lives were linked and each depended upon the other. A scientist who works with wasps is known as a Vespologist, so it may be a better name for Amos. Amos the Vespologist. I'll bet you didn't know about the life cycle of the wasp, but in just a few minutes you will. Here's what happens to the sycamore fig tree over and over its entire life. In the spring, figs are produced, and unripe figs appear on the tree. Shortly after that, the tiny little wasp finds an unripe fig and bores a hole to get into the inside of it to get to the flowers. Now, this wasp will invariably carry pollen with it that it's collected from other fig trees. And these wasps will not burrow inside ripe figs. Instead, they scratch all around on the inside of the flowers and deposit pollen as they go. And this fertilizes the flowers. Some wasps will lay eggs inside the fruit, some will die inside the fruit, and others will make it back out, and they bear pollen from this fig tree and fly then to other trees to continue pollinating. Eventually, their larvae will hatch. Males always hatch first and hang around inside the fig until the females hatch. Then they fertilize the young females who leave with fig pollen from the flower in which they were born, and they fly off to other fig trees where they bore into a new fig and lay eggs, and the cycle continues. Some females, of course, leave the fig without collecting pollen, and they will fly to another tree and burrow into a fig, but because they carry no pollen, the fruit will wither and die and fall off the tree. So if females fly to a tree and find unripe fruit, they crawl in, lay eggs, and soon a host of little wasps are crawling all around on the inside. Can you imagine what a wasp-infected fig tastes like? Crunchy and not sweet, tart and tangy, just what a fig should not taste like. So fig tree owners brought in Amos and others like him to hasten the ripening of the fruit as soon as it appears, to keep the female wasps from getting inside, because they will not bore into ripe fruit. Now, just what did Amos do? He had a knife with a very tiny but very sharp blade. He would climb the tree, find an unripe fig, and simply pierce its skin with the knife. Now, they did not know why it worked, but it did work. We now know that a pierced fig begins to produce ethylene gas, which is a catalyst, and it causes fruit to ripen very quickly. All they knew was that piercing an unripe fig would make it ripen within hours. They also knew that these tiny wasps will not enter ripe fruit, so the figs they would collect and sell would be free of pesky wasp larvae and crunchy wasp bodies. Amos was particularly important to tree owners, but his work was hard. He had to crawl up tree branches and pierce each unripe fruit. That was a very tough job, and it was done at the hottest part of the year. So here's an application you can take away from this lesson on Amos's job. If you want to ripen up fruit quickly, green tomatoes, unripe apples, or any kind of fruit, place a ripe banana with them. Bananas produce volumes of ethylene gas. You should never, ever store bananas with other fruit. Or you can take the reverse of this process. Now, Walmart and other stores sell ethylene gas absorbers, which proclaim that they can keep your fruit lasting longer. Throw one of these into your fruit crisper, and it will keep your fruit lasting longer. I'm also willing to bet you don't know this. Walmart uses this principle often. Their produce trucks pick up green tomatoes, for instance, which have just been picked. On the way to the store, these tomatoes are gassed with ethylene. By the time they arrive at the store, they all are a tasty red color. Have you ever wondered why all those tomatoes look exactly the same shade of red? Well, it's ethylene gas, and that's why. I'll bet you didn't know that. Amos came on the scene during the reign of King Jeroboam of Israel. Now, this king did some amazing things to expand his territory tremendously. He expanded it to the size that it was during King Solomon. And it was a tremendously prosperous time. Israel traded with countries to the north and south in wine and oil and horses, and the trade routes brought in information. The seafaring Phoenicians were really the internet of their day, and it constantly brought new ideas and new food from distant lands. But during this time, the time of Jeroboam, the rich exploited the poor terribly. What archaeologists found was there were no middle-class houses built in the cities at all during this time. You were either extraordinarily rich or terribly, terribly poor. Along with the tremendous military exploits of Jeroboam in the north came tremendously wicked ideas. It was a time of rampant idolatry and sex. It was a total collapse of morality. Worship was no longer restricted to just Jerusalem, and altars at both Dan in the north and Bethel in the south appeared, and they began to rival the Jewish temple in Israel. Here is a before and after map. Notice how Israel, in brown, expanded in all directions before 760 BC, and beginning then and afterwards, it expanded north into Syria. It expanded east into Ammon, which today we know as Jordan, and it extended south into Moab. Notice also that Azariah in the south was beginning to expand his borders as well. He took over a lot of the land area to the left, including the pentathlon, the 5 cities of Philistia, and he moved down to the east into Edom. So, what is America's wealth distribution? Look at this chart for just a minute, and it's assuming that A represents, the red in A would represent 90% of the United States, the B would represent 80%, and the C would represent about 70%. So you have 90, 80, 70. Is it A, that the top 20% in America own 90% and the bottom only owns 10? Or B, the top 20% owns 80% and the bottom 80% own only 20%? Or is it C, the top 20% owns 70%? What do you think? Well, the truth is, in our nation today, the top 20% of Americans own 90% of all of the wealth that is produced in this fair country. And the bottom 80% only owns 10% of the wealth. So at the end of his book, he presents 8 judgments on the people of the area. First, here's what's going to happen to your enemies just to the north of you, Syria, the king in the valley of Avon, who holds scepter in Beth Eden. High places where Jeroboam erected temple and the golden calf were there. Because the Arameans sledged Gilead, as is told in 2 Kings chapter 10, they came and ransacked Gilead. Gilead is an area to the east that was given to Gad and Reuben. It gets about 28 to 30 inches of rainfall every year. It's deeply wooded and is well suited for raising cattle. That's where Jacob fled from his father-in-law, and David fled there from Absalom. And because they had been sledged with iron teeth, which were wooden boards with iron togs, and these were drug over the threshing floor, and it separates wheat from husks, because they, the Jews, had been drug over with these sledges. Ben-Hadad, the king, and Syria will be taken captive and will be exiled into what he referred to as Kir. And we know that this happened. The Assyrians came and conquered them before they came into Israel. So you can see the picture of the girl there, and I'm going to display that picture many times to give you an idea of probably what the Israelite of the day and probably how they would have responded. So when you talked about the first one, Damascus, you say, okay, I've heard people talking about Damascus before, not a big deal. What's it got to do with me? Then he starts talking about Gaza, how that Gaza were going to get their just comeuppance as well. Now Gaza is the region of the Philistines to the Israel's southwest. Gaza was one of the 5 major cities of the Philistines, all near the coast and all with small harbors. During the reign of Ahaz, the Philistines sold Israelites into slavery to Edom. The Philistines were conquered eventually by the Assyrians in 758 BC and then later by Sargon in 711 BC. So obviously the Jew of the day would have paid a little more attention. Now you're talking about some people that we really don't care for. Then he starts talking about Tyre. Tyre also sold Israelites into captivity. Ezekiel promised Tyre would be completely destroyed, and Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Tyre for 13 years in 752 BC, but he could not conquer the small island city because he did not have a navy. Eventually, Alexander the Great came and shut off the island city for 6 months, and then he built a walkway in the harbor out to the little the little island by pounding tall cedar trees and filling them in with debris from the mainland city. And he built up a road out to it. And then seed works were brought in and actually tore down those walls, just like was predicted here by the prophet Amos. So you can see she's a little happier, and I think they all would have been. Right? That's 3 of our enemies. But when he talked about Edom, they would have been delighted. Now, Edom was the cousin of the Israelites. They were descendants of Esau. And they inhabited the area to the southeast of Judah. And they had failed to support Israel ever since the conquest under Joshua. We read a lot more about Edom in Obadiah. He talks about fire on Teman, a mountain area, that is going to destroy Basra, which is a city in Edom. Ammon. Ammon today we know as Jordan. It's the capital of Jordan. And these were descendants of Lot's son, Ben-Ami, closely tied to the Moabites who did not allow Israel to pass through their land on the way to the promised land. They joined with Moab to hire Balaam to curse Israel. And the Israelites were told never to socialize with them. They attacked Jabesh Gilead in Saul's name and demanded they gouge out their eyes or they die. Saul defeated Ammon. Amos promised the king would go into exile and the city would be destroyed by fire, and then David completely conquered them. But by the time of Amos, they were back and they were causing trouble for the Jews. Eventually, he talks about Moab. Moab is located to the southeast of Israel. They traced their ancestry back to Lot. Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel. Ruth came to Moab to live. Israel, Judah, and Edom came together to attack Moab, but the king offered his own son to show his belief in his own cause, and the attack failed. So Israel and Moab had a long relationship of hatred toward each other. But primarily, as Amos says, because Moab burned the bones of the king of Edom, he will be destroyed by fire. Look how delighted the Israelites must have been by this time for Amos to have accounted Damascus and Gaza and Tyre and Edom and Ammon and Moab. But he's not finished. He talks about Judah next. Now, if you're an Israelite, that's the one thing that would make you jump for joy, talking about how Judah was going to get it, because they rejected the law of the Lord and they were led astray into idol worship. The fortresses of Jerusalem will be destroyed, and Nebuchadnezzar would come on the scene and do this, just like Amos promised in 586 BC. Well, everything was going fine up until this point, but now he starts getting his nose put in places where it shouldn't be. You're now meddling, prophet. Hold on. When you start talking about the sins of Israel, our sins, and these are things that Amos says. He says that they sell the righteous for trivial amounts. They trample on the poor. They deny justice to the oppressed. They have sexual deviancy. Fathers and sons are lying with the same woman. They lie down beside altars on garments taken in pledge. That is prostitution at shrines that were there for that purpose. They drink wine taken as fines. They forced the Nazarites to drink wine. They commanded the prophets not to prophesy. And Israel will be destroyed. They will be crushed as a loaded cart crushes things in its path. Swift, strong warriors will not survive, and no one will get away. No soldiers, no horsemen, no archers, and even the bravest warriors will flee on that day. So these are the 8 judgments that Amos gives. He's doing okay until he gets down to the very last one, obviously, when he starts talking about Israel, because they trample